This lecture is a lecture focusing on the Gilded Age, and in particular, some of those individuals that have become these historic figures in American history, the captains of industry, the wealthiest Americans, the people who rose up in prominence in industries such as automobiles and steel and oil. And I want to start off with a question, which is, should these people be considered as captains of industry, the leaders, the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the success stories that we should celebrate and remember? Or are these people more appropriately titled robber barons? These people who are corrupt, do anything what is necessary to get ahead, crooked, breaking the law? And the answer probably is somewhere in between. Now, the first individual, because there's a lot of these individuals, but the first guy is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, there he is as a young boy, was a Scottish immigrant who came to the United States from Scotland at the age of 12. And he worked for the railroads, and this individual, 5'3", shorty guy, rises to become the head, the steel industry leader. And Carnegie rises to prominence, and he's an interesting story. So you have this guy, like I said, if you have some time, you're into it, the History Channel has a pretty decent series called The Men Who Built America, and there's a whole episode dedicated to Andrew Carnegie, so check it out on the website or on YouTube or whatever other source you can get it. So there's Carnegie right there with his brother. This guy comes to America at the age of 12. He rises up to become an interesting fellow. Here's Carnegie as a younger man, there he is as an older man, there he is as a very wealthy rich man, and then what most people don't know about Carnegie is he eventually retires from the steel industry and becomes the captain of the Titanic. They look so much alike, it's scary. So that's an unhidden, unspoken, historical story right there. Now, back to reality. One of the things that Carnegie was so good at was opening up and taking ideas that he sees. In fact, in the 1850s, he's over in England and he's touring some steel mills, and he comes across this process called the Bessemer process. And the Bessemer process was being utilized, and it was a better way.
I admit it's getting better, a little better all the time. Yes, I admit it's getting better.
A better way to produce steel. When I say better, it's because it's cheaper. And you could see by these two graphs that the production of steel in the United States is going up, and it's going up pretty substantially. But the price is going down. So the Bessemer process allows for people like Carnegie to produce steel that's cheaper and of better quality. So Carnegie has a business approach that takes a lot of different things that most successful business people do. For one, he gets ideas from others. It's getting better all the time. The Bessemer process. But he also does other things. It's not just, taking others. He does something called cost analysis, where he is looking at his factories and he is measuring how much their output and their production is, and knowing the production cost for each ton of steel, and knowing where things are not producing efficiently enough. And he competed with his factories. He incentivized high production. So he does that. He also does price fixing. He priced his steel below the competition. And if you want to think about that, real simple idea here, if your competition is selling it for 10, you sell it for 9. Because then the consumer is going to buy yours. And eventually your competition isn't going to be able to compete any longer, and you can either buy them out, they go bankrupt, and you can jack up your price. So price fixing was used. Manipulating the market. He also does some things that I guess good businessmen can do, but we may put a sad face on.
Damn!
Kept wages relatively low. In fact, his workers were oftentimes forced to work in extremely difficult conditions, and very often they were not protected through unions or other means. So his wealth was extraordinary, but it came at a cost. And then key thing in business, sometimes it's not what you know, it's who you know. And because Carnegie got his start in the business world in the railroad industry, he had a lot of hookups. He had a lot of people who he knew. And of course, if railroad production is increasing, the demand for steel is increasing. So he does these different things. And then finally, something called vertical integration. Vertical integration is probably something that the name sounds scary, but think about vertical. It's going up and down, vertical like this. And so vertical integration is a very simple idea if you break it down, if you think about it as going like this. And what it means is you, as a business owner, you want it all. You want from the beginning of production, the raw materials, to the distribution of the raw materials, to the production, the manufacturing, to the distribution of your finished product. You want every aspect of production. You want from the bottom to the top. You want it all.
I want it all. Money, fast cars, diamond rings, gold chains, and champagne shit. Every damn thing, I want it all. Houses, expenses, my own business, a truck,
And a couple of business, I want it all.
brand new socks and drawers.
And I'm ballin'.
Every time I stop and talk to y'all,
I want it all.
all.
I want all aspects of manufacturing. So from extracting the raw materials to selling the finished product. So let's forget steel for a moment because it's way too complicated. I don't quite get how it's made. I like it. It's strong. It's cool. But it was beyond my comprehension. So let's just take something like the meat industry. So if you had vertical integration of the meat industry, you would own the cattle. You would own the slaughterhouse where the cattle are killed. Sorry, vegetarians. You would own the railroad cars that transport the slaughtered carcasses of animals. You would own the warehouses where the meat is stored and cooled. The meat packing plants where it's carved up into different little choice meats, prime rib, ribeye, all that stuff. And then you'd own the transport to eventually the consumer. You own all levels of production. And if you think about it, this is brilliant because this allows you to eliminate the middleman. There's nobody you have to pay. You're paying yourself because you own all parts of it. So Carnegie and other business leaders utilize vertical integration to maximize their profits. Now, if you take something more, Gilded Age industrial revolutionary, for example, the oil production, vertical integration can be seen by looking at this particular graphic. So you would own the production of the raw materials, the extraction from the ground, the transport of that crude oil, the processing of that crude oil, the transport of the crude oil, the fuel and the oil and whatnot, and then eventually the sale to the consumers. This is something that Rockefeller will do. So vertical integration was utilized by Carnegie in the steel industry. He also utilized horizontal integration. And the idea behind horizontal integration is you want the businesses to come together.
Come together right now over me.
Now this is not come together in some warm fuzzy ways, let's just all get together and work together. This is, imagine for a moment, this is Carnegie Steel, this is Joe Steel, and this is, Jorge Steel's. If you're Carnegie, you don't want these other guys there because that's competition. So what do? You try to get rid of them. You do price fixing, you do, anything you can to get rid of the competition, and eventually all these three will be Carnegie Steel. This is horizontal. Horizontal being going from left to right. So you take out the competition so that you are able to maximize your profit. And Carnegie, once again, is not the only one doing this because during this period of time, all these different businesses are taking advantage of vertical or horizontal integration, controlling the process of production or controlling a whole particular industry. So this gets done.
Come together right now. Oh.
over me.
In fact, during this period of time, we have tremendous amount of corporate mergers, consolidation, businesses buying out other businesses, businesses taking over other businesses, and eventually, if there's only one company, if there's only a McDonald's, and there's no Burger King or In-N-Out or Jack in the Box, we call that a monopoly. Consumers have no choice. There is only one. If there is only a Carnegie Steel, that is a monopoly. There's no competition. So monopolies were increasingly becoming a problem during this period of time known as the Gilded Age. So Carnegie is getting extremely rich. Different images of the steel industry, the production. By 1900, Carnegie Steel is the largest corporation in the world. He's producing 1/3 of the world's steel, and it becomes the symbol of industrial progress. Think about it. Without steel, the skyscrapers, the magnificent bridges that linking up these different cities and neighborhoods don't get built. They refer to it as King Steel. You get the formation of these skyscrapers. You get this all-important production of steel. And Carnegie is without a doubt one of the most successful businessmen of his time. In fact, he has the distinction of becoming the first billion-dollar company. Famously in 1901, another business leader, J.P. Morgan, who was the head of Federal Steel, basically calls up Carnegie. What do you want for your company, Carnegie Steel? And eventually those two businesses merge, and you get the company U.S. Steel being created, worth $1 billion. Now, that's a simplified version. There's a lot of things that Carnegie did, and we're going to take a look at those in class and in your textbook. But I want to point something else out. The confusing thing about a man like Carnegie is,
I know I'd go from rags to riches.
he's the dream, right? The American dream. This story of a guy, a young immigrant boy, 5'3", coming over from Scotland at the age of 12 and rising to become one of the most wealthy men ever in American history, is the stuff that this American dream people refer to, rising from rags to riches. You know, from the Ragged Dick dime novels of the time period to the reality TV shows where people are watching who's going to be the next fashion icon or the dance person or the American Idol. We love this story of coming from nothing to something. And Carnegie, in spite of, some people's views of him, is going to donate a huge amount of his wealth to charity. Libraries, museums, hospitals, universities. In fact, there was this dual nature of Carnegie. On the one hand, he's the ruthless business leader who's slashing wages for the workers and, busting up unions and keeping working conditions extremely poor. And on the other hand, he's this caring philanthropist who's giving away his wealth to schools and education and hospitals and research and things like that. This double role. And he had a philosophy about the responsibility of the wealthy. And it was called the Gospel of Wealth. I mean, Carnegie said that it is the responsibility of the rich to help improve society. That it is the job of those individuals who have made it, who have become extremely wealthy, to give back. In fact, here's a quote by Carnegie. He says, "It would be a great mistake for the community to shoot the millionaires, for they are the bees that make the most honey and contribute the most to the hive, even after they have gorged themselves full." So there's nothing wrong with being rich. The rich do wonderful things for society through their philanthropy, their charity. And Carnegie believed in this idea of the gospel of wealth. He made it rain. Here, I love this political cartoon. Carnegie with his little Scottish kilt with the American flag, and he's throwing money in all sorts of different hats. So that wealthy should act as the trustees for the poor. And they should contribute. And all these different things. And he did. But at the same time he's doing this, he is the same guy who was behind some of the worst labor disputes in early American history. In fact, one of the things you're going to learn about is something called the Homestead Strike. And Carnegie and his business partner, this individual, Henry Clay Frick, are going to be responsible for the violence, partly responsible for the violence that takes place at a steel mill called Homestead, where workers and police and National Guards clash and people lose their lives over the violence. So how do we remember Carnegie? Hero, villain, captain of industry, robber baron? Depends on who you ask. And that's how many viewed them, though. In fact, here you have another of these political cartoons from the Gilded Age, and in this case, you have the robber barons of the past, the nobles, the wealthy, the rich over here, and the olden days, Europe, taking from the commoners. But in the Gilded Age, it's a different kind of nobility. It's the wealthy, it's the monopolies, it's the trust. And they, with their big fat bodies, are taking and having the workers grovel. So this was the different views or perspectives of these individuals. It's interesting. We have these debates today. What is the responsibility of the wealthy? How much should the wealthy be taxed? How should we give money to people who are less fortunate? People like Bill and his wife Melinda Gates pledged to give away billions of dollars. And so how does this play out today? The other guy of the Gilded Age that we're going to focus on in today's lecture is interesting. John D. Rockefeller. It's The Rock.
And I am. And they ask me, I tell them. Raise your glasses.
Rockefeller is an interesting guy. I mean, first off, he's quite interesting looking, but yet has inspired people. As random as Jay-Z. Jay-Z, when he was making his record label, when he was first coming up in the music industry, chose the name Rockefeller, partly because he was inspired by the hustle, the struggle, the way that Rockefeller had his hands in everything, and he was the best of the businessmen of his time. And people of the Gilded Age, these industrialists, they oftentimes had these portraits created. And here's a famous picture of Rockefeller. I think it was done like in 1914, 1915, something like that. And I remember, I want to show you, I was in a museum once in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and I walk in and there's this giant portrait of Ladies Love Cool J, LL Cool J, and he's sitting very similarly to the way Rockefeller was in his portrait that was done over 100 years ago. And inside the museum, you had this giant portrait. It was huge. It's like 8 feet, tall. And the point of this, of the artist, was to challenge the visitors to think about these new entrepreneurs in America, this rise to the top. Obviously, LL Cool J is making hip-hop music and, love songs for the ladies and making some TV shows and movies. He's not an oil tycoon, but the story of Rockefeller inspired people as diverse as LL Cool J and Jay-Z. And so he wanted to, show this in these pieces of art and to see people's reactions when you have these young black entertainers and artists being put right alongside old monarchs and nobles and business tycoons in these extravagant museum displays. Now Rockefeller, here he is at age 18.
And I am. And they ask me, I tell them. Raise your glasses.
Firmly believed in this idea. In fact, there's a quote of his: "The growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest." And what Rockefeller and Carnegie and people like them believed is that the strong business survives and the weak does not. And of course, Carnegie is going to get his rise in steel. Rockefeller's going to get his in the industry you see right on your screen, the oil industry. In fact, he starts off in Cleveland, in the Pittsburgh area, and he starts buying up these refineries and these oil wells. And Rockefeller Rockefeller starts becoming the leader of the oil industry. In fact, much like Carnegie, he uses a lot of the same business tactics.
And I am. And they ask me, I tell them. Raise your glasses.
He becomes the head of Standard Oil in 1873. Just like Carnegie, he uses vertical integration, buying up the supply process to the distribution process to the sale process. And then by 1879, John D. Rockefeller owns 90% of the oil refineries, which is a huge segment of the market. And, he gets his kickbacks and his discounts from railroad companies. He takes out his competition where he can. He makes some smart business moves. He makes some ruthless business moves. And very quickly, Standard Oil Company is the kind of icon of business in America at this time. In fact, by 1882, Standard Oil forms a trust. And Standard Oil becomes the beast of the business world. You can see it in this political cartoon. It's an octopus. It's taking over the workers, the Congress, the White House, the courts. It has its hands in everything. In fact, one of the strategies that Rockefeller used was something called pooling or pools, in which he made agreements among companies. Even if he didn't take you over, you had agreements and you had to kind of, go along with them to control prices and carve up markets. So the way Carnegie and Rockefeller rise to the top is remarkable, but also sometimes controversial. Rockefeller also used horizontal integration, and in the oil industry in particular, was very quickly competition was being destroyed and removed. No competition was Rockefeller's hope.
No competition. Competition is none. I remain at the top like the sun, and I burn whoever come in the chambers of torture.
No competition. Getting rid of those, merging competing oil companies into one giant corporation. So if you can, these independent oil refineries, you eventually buy them out, you take them over, and you form one giant corporation, monopolizing the market, getting rid of competition, horizontal integration. And Rockefeller is very successful, like I said, 90% of his market share. And when you have this kind of power, you can influence prices, you can set the market tone, and so you have this being done. He becomes this epic business leader, this titan of the business world, and begins to be looked at. The society begins to question Rockefeller, and you could see, this view of him. He's this giant. He has the government in the palm of his hands, and you have Congress being, converted into some sort of oil refinery at the mercy of Standard Oil. And Rockefeller, regardless of what you said, is successful in this world. Now, questions start to rise, and the question that starts to rise is, should the government regulate business and the economy? People start to, ask this question because they're seeing the success of people of the Gilded Age, these captains of industry, and they start questioning. And the answer is, every time they ask these questions, should the government regulate monopolies?
Christmas?
No.
Should the government help out the poor?
Do you love your mommy?
No.
Should the government pass laws protecting workers?
No. No.
Should the government set minimum wage and with safety standards?
No.
Should the government ban child
Do you
labor?
love your grandparents?
No.
Do you want $1 million?
No.
Do you love your duppy?
No.
It's like the cutest thing ever.
No.
Do
No,
you love
no.
bath time?
No regulation.
Is there anything you like?
No.
And if you ask that baby, should the government regulate the business and the economy? Many of the business leaders would have said, no. These questions are starting to be asked. And this idea of regulating is not supported by many of these business leaders. In fact, they believe in the world of social Darwinism. In fact, this is a quote by Andrew Carnegie. Hit pause and read it. This idea of survival of the fittest. The strong survive and the weak, they fade off, they go away. And the big philosophy, the thing you need to know, without a doubt, is this French term called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire? Laissez-faire. And the laissez-faire basically is a French term which means allowed to do. And according to this idea of laissez-faire, this was the time frame, this is a belief in many people during the Gilded Age, especially those in the business world, that government should get out the way to allow business to do what it wants to do. Government should move!
Get out the way, get out the way, get out the way,
Move!
get out the way, get out the way, get out.
Government should not regulate. It should get out the way. It should not get in the way of business. There should not be government regulations. So back to the previous slide where the baby's saying, no, no, no. That was the response, because laissez-faire, social Darwinism, was the belief of this time period. The government should stand aside and let things happen. And this is one of the big debates we're having right now. Should we have this philosophy? How much should the government regulate, if it should regulate? And we'll cover those topics next time.